When you're driving, nothing's better than a suspenseful podcast. But when you want to save on gas, drama's the last thing you want. That's why Marathon makes it easy to save with Marathon Rewards, earning you at least 5 cents a gallon in rewards with every fuel up and saving you up to $1 a gallon. Plus, signing up is easy. Do it at the pump or marathonrewards.com. So start saving with rewards from Marathon. And don't miss the Thomas Rhett Veteran Boot Tour this summer, fueled by Marathon. At participating locations. Terms and conditions apply.
Hey, I'm Paige DeSorbo, and I'm always thinking about underwear.
I'm Hannah Berner, and I'm also thinking about underwear, but I prefer full coverage. I like to call them my granny panties.
Actually, I never think about underwear. That's the magic of Tommy John.
Same. They're so light and so comfy, and if it's not comfortable, I'm not wearing it.
And the bras, soft, supportive, and actually breathable.
Yes, Lord knows the girls need to breathe. Also, I need my PJs to breathe and be buttery soft and stretchy enough for my dramatic tossing and turning at night. That's why I live in my Tommy John pajamas.
Plus, they're so cute because they fit perfectly.
Put yourself on to Tommy John.
Upgrade your drawer with Tommy John. Save 25% for a limited time at TommyJohn.com/comfort. See site for details.
Hello and welcome to episode number 285 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Rona Anderson, Auntie Bats 27, Rachel, Heather, Mark Opie, Hezekiah, and Kate Barnard. Thank you all so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, is Boys from County Hell. Boys from County Hell was released in 2020. It has 5.9 out of 10 on IMDb and 82% on Rotten Tomatoes. The Irish backcountry of 6 Mile Hill is abruptly disturbed when some construction workers accidentally awaken a fabled vampire by disrupting his grave and fight him in order to survive the night. So I had an awareness of this film for ages, and I just never really got around to watching it. And listen, this film is so fun. It was such a pleasant surprise. I kind of thought it was going to be a bit shit, but it really isn't. It has such a good cast, and I'd like to give a special shout out to Frafi, who is an actor, and I love him, and I was delighted to see him in this, and the rest of the cast. Top class. Loved it. Was really just loved seeing familiar faces and going, oh, you did this film. And obviously I love Irish folklore, and I love it when Irish folklore is presented in a modern context. And the story of Abhartach is a very real bit of Irish vampire folklore, right? Now, he would not have been in the Irish lore, he would not have been referred to as a vampire because that is a more modern word, obviously. But this is what the story centres around. And it's a very real legend, a very real local lore. And what they do really nicely, I thought, is they stayed away from kind of well-worn vampire tropes, which actually wouldn't have applied to this version of a vampire legend. So, for example, we know that certain things kill vampires in the stories, certain items, for example, and we learn very quickly in this story that things are not as they seem with Abhartach, and actually this is going to be significantly more difficult. I also really loved in this story that Abhartach is so powerful that if he is nearby, blood is attracted to him. So he's almost parasitic, the way that he's so powerful, which is a fresh take on the vampire lore. It's not as simple as a bite and, leeching the blood out of people. There's more to it than that, which I enjoyed. I thought the script was really funny, and I thought it felt really Irish. Like, there were lots of brilliant one-liners. there were lots of moments where they're all in these situations of great peril, but also recognizing that this situation is insane, that they're dealing with some sort of vampire, and they're all struggling to come to terms with that, as I feel you would in this situation. And I felt like it was written really authentically. And obviously there's the, overarching narrative, which is that they are trying to fight this vampire. But there's a lot of layers to it too. I felt like it touched on a lot of kind of emotional elements too, without being too soppy and, heart-wrenching. It kind of references a lot being stuck in small town Ireland with not very many opportunities and what that means for younger people. I felt like it also touched on father and son dynamics and how difficult some men can find it to process emotions, but also to express emotions in a healthy way. I thought there was a nice reference to grief and how grief can be a really difficult thing to navigate for families. All things that are, pretty important emotional touch points without being too sentimental about the whole thing. The other thing that I liked is this idea of the modernisation of rural Ireland. And it kind of gave me, I've spoken about this before, but there are stories all over Ireland of farms, of fairy forts, fairy rings, fairy trees that people don't disturb in the modernisation of Ireland through the building of houses, roads, etc., because they don't want to get bad luck. And that feels like this real friction between the old ways and the modern world. And I kind of like that, and this film showed that really well too. And the thing that they did, which I talk about all the time, is they didn't spend too much time trying to show us Abhartach, the vampire. The film, I imagine, was relatively low budget. And when you have a relatively low budget film, I don't think it's worthwhile to try and have a really, scary CGI monster, because it's just not going to happen. And I think they managed that really well in this film. You get glimpses of him, and he is quite terrifying and powerful and strong. And there's a lot of implications as to how big and scary he is, rather than trying to show him and ultimately him being just this big disappointment. And I'm going to be honest, right? In terms of dislikes, this film isn't life-changing. As a horror, it's relatively low on scares. There are moments of tension. There are moments where there's little jumpy bits. There are gory moments, but nothing too crazy to talk about. I do think vampire films, though, are quite hard to make genuinely frightening, like heart-in-mouth frightening. There were also elements of the plot that I was like, wait, what? That doesn't really make sense in regards to what's going on. And it sort of, it felt like they were trying to develop this story, but didn't quite have the time to develop it properly. They were trying to fit in a lot into a short run time, and maybe it needed to be either stripped back in order to give a bit more understanding to what was happening. Like, I could understand the lore and the exposition around the lore, but then how that impacted the modern world kind of got a bit convoluted at times. So maybe it needed to be stripped back, or it needed to be fleshed out and the runtime needed to be longer, right? Because it's quite a short film. And I did see a lot of reviews that said it just wasn't funny. But I laughed the whole way through it. Like, I genuinely really enjoyed the one-liners. And I don't know if it's kind of like because I grew up in small town Ireland, like I grew up in rural Ireland, so I could see people that I knew in all of the characters that were being portrayed. So maybe the humour in the style just isn't really for everybody. But as I was watching it, I enjoyed it so much that I decided to last minute change what my episode was going to be about this week. I never intended on doing an episode about Abhartach and other Irish vampire legends, but I was inspired by this film. I thought, yeah, that was really fun to watch. Let's do some Irish vampire legends. So it can't be a bad film if it does that. So for me, Boys from County Hell is a 4-star film. And if you want a fun, entertaining vampire film that's not going to keep you awake at night, but it is going to make you laugh, then, I don't know, check out this film. I think you might enjoy it.
Ever wonder why you have insurance for your car or home, but not your digital life? Meet WebRoot Total Protection, your digital bodyguard that is built for real life. WebRoot takes the guessing game out of cybersecurity so you can confidently browse, bank, and be yourself online without the worry of hackers lurking around the corner. With WebRoot Total Protection, you get antivirus that scans 6 times faster and takes up 33 times less space than the other guys. Identity protection with up to $1 million in fraud expense reimbursement and 24/7 US-based customer support. VPN protection that hides your IP address, personal data, and location from hackers. And cloud backup with unlimited storage that works automatically in the background. With plans for individuals and families, WebRoot makes it easy to live a better digital life. Go to webroot.com/promo and get 50% off today. That's webroot.com/promo to get 50% off today. Live a better digital life with WebRoot, because peace of mind shouldn't be optional.
Hey, I'm Paige DeSorbo, and I'm always thinking about underwear.
I'm Hannah Berner, and I'm also thinking about underwear, but I prefer full coverage. I like to call them my granny panties.
Actually, I never think about underwear. That's the magic of Tommy John.
Same. They're so light and so comfy, and if it's not comfortable, I'm not wearing it.
And the bras, soft, supportive, and actually breathable.
Yes, Lord knows the girls need to breathe. Also, I need my PJs to breathe and be buttery soft and stretchy enough for my dramatic tossing and turning at night. That's why I live in my Tommy John pajamas.
Plus, they're so cute because they fit perfectly.
Put yourself on to Tommy John.
Upgrade your drawer with Tommy John. Save 25% for a limited time at TommyJohn.com/comfort. See site for details.
What's it like to care for someone who's sick? To wait for answers, to hope for healing. These are the moments our nation's healthcare teams and their patients face every single day. And it's why we do what we do. We're Siemens Healthineers, and we pioneer breakthroughs in healthcare for everyone, everywhere. Across the country, from rural communities to busy cities, our medical imaging, therapy, and laboratory solutions help providers deliver care that can be smarter, faster, and more precise. With more than 17,000 employees across the United States, we're driving innovations that support healthcare teams, strengthen systems, and truly change people's lives. Because for us, it's about more than technology, more than innovation. It's a promise, built for generations. Siemens Healthineers.
Which brings us to our story this week. Now, if you're a long-time Patreon subscriber, a number of years ago, I covered the story of Abhartach, and we're doing it again. We're recycling old content. However, I've changed things up. I've added new stories, so please don't feel like you are being sold short. As always with these episodes, the links to my sources are in the description of this episode, so let's get into it. When I was a child, I had a vested interest in all things spooky. A shocker, I know. And there are some books that stayed with me. Books that I have either never let go of since I was a child, books that I have packed and unpacked and carted between countries and houses umpteen times. There are books that I have hunted as an adult, trying to recapture old stories and spooky nostalgia. The book Bloody Irish by Bob Curran was one of those books. And it was in that book that I first read that an Irish legend may have at least partially inspired the most famous vampire story, Dracula. And that information blew my mind. The ancient Celts had a reverence for death and for the dead. They did not see death as the end. They simply saw it as a transition period, a movement from one world to the next world. The dead had the power to protect and to care for their loved ones. And sometimes they could return to warn or to punish. And in some cases they wanted recognition for this service. The dead could return and wish to be fed, to be sated in a more earthly way. Particularly around the time of what we now know as Halloween. The veil was thinner, and the dead would return to their loved ones. People would leave out whiskey and bread for the deceased, and they would scatter ashes by the fireside at night. And if those ashes were disturbed in the morning, the household would know that the dead had sat by the fire, eating and drinking. And here's where the vampire lore creeps in. If a family did not provide enough to satisfy the reanimated corpses of their loved ones, then the undead would feed on the most valuable life source that was available to them: blood. For the ancient Celts, blood was very important. They recognised it as a life source, and as such, when the crops failed or they were hoping for a good harvest, they would spill blood on the ground in order to give the ground life. They offered human blood sacrifice to fertility gods. With the spread of Christianity, those practices became vilified. The idea of the blood-drinking dead was suddenly not simply loved ones being paid for their ongoing protection, but rather a demonstration of evil, something to be feared. Which brings us back to Dracula. Bram Stoker had never been to Romania, although he did research it extensively for his writing. And there are some literary scholars who suggest that the landscape he describes in the book is reminiscent of an Irish landscape. The book was written in the 1890s, not long after the Great Hunger, where bloodletting became a common tool for starving Irish people to try and get some nutrition. Animals were bled, and their blood was mixed with oats and vegetable scraps to eat. Stoker visited Derry, where the story of Abhartach lives, and would likely have heard the tale. And Abhartach wasn't the only Irish vampire tale that was whispered to frightened children in front of the fire at night time. There were many. In the north of Ireland, there is a county called Derry, and hidden away in a rural part of the north of the county is the Giant's Grave, or Leacht Abhartach. The grave itself is not a cairn like is portrayed in the Boys from County Hell film, but rather it is a large and heavy stone that resides beneath a curling thorn bush. At one point in time, this would have actually been a large monument, but over time some of the stones have been removed. And as with all old folklore, there are many versions of what lies beneath the large stone. But the consensus is that it is something dark, something evil, something otherworldly. During the 5th and 6th centuries, Ireland was split up into many kingdoms. Now, these kingdoms were not what we would imagine a kingdom to be now. These kingdoms were simply areas that had their own local ruler. They were known as kings, but they were not kings as we know them, and there were many of them. Nevertheless, these tribal warlords were important, and these kingdoms were important. The Irish countryside is dotted with hill forts and raths and fortifications that demonstrate how important these kingdoms were and how fiercely they were protected by their inhabitants. It would be easy to think that Abhartach, this wild and fearsome vampire, was a creature that was using one of these kingdoms as a hunting ground. But no, Abhartach was a chieftain, a king of one of these lands. There are many descriptions of Abhartach. Some say that he was a small creature with many deformities, and others say that he was a powerful dark wizard capable of great evil. Some stories say that he enjoyed torturing his subjects, especially his wife, of whom he was insanely jealous. He was convinced that she was having an adulterous affair, and one night he climbed out of a window in his castle and inched his way along a ledge, determined to climb through her window and catch her in the act. He instead plummeted to his death. There is another version where he was so cruel to his subjects that they conspired against him, determined to get rid of him, and they enlisted the help of another local chieftain, Curran, to take him down. Curran slew the dark wizard and buried him standing upright in an isolated grave. However he met his end, there is one thing that remains unanimous in the stories. Abhartach kept coming back. He rose from his upright grave and descended upon the townspeople again, demanding a blood sacrifice from them to quell his gnawing hunger. The townspeople were forced to let the blood from their veins in order to feed Abhartach bowls of the ruby liquid. They were terrified. Once again the townsfolk went to Curran, and once again Curran slayed the monster, only for Abhartach to return hungrier than ever. Tucked away in Gurtnamoya Forest, was an old hermitage inhabited by a holy man. Cahan had no idea how to defeat this creature or what this creature even really was, so he sought out this holy man for answers. Abhartach, the holy man told him, was one of the Naev Warav. He was one of the undead. And even more worrying, he was a Darag Julie, a drinker of human blood. Unlike the modern vampire equivalents, where they can be vanquished with garlic or sunlight or a stake through the heart, there was no way to kill Abhartach. He could only be contained. Abhartach must be slain with a sword made from yew wood, and must be buried upside down in the earth. Thorns and ash twigs must be sprinkled around him, and a heavy stone must be placed directly on top of him. If the stone were ever moved, then Abhartach would roam the land once more. Cahan did as he was instructed, and he built a great sepulchre over the grave. And from the thorns grew the tree which remains to this day. The legend, of course, is a great yarn which people still tell to this day, myself included, but the impact of it on the land itself is still evident. The land is considered to be bad ground, and has been the root of many family breakdowns throughout the years. Any attempt to clear the stone or the tree has been met with disaster. In 1997, workmen attempted to cut down the tree, and their brand new chainsaw simply refused to work. They attempted to lift the great stone, and on doing so, the chain snapped, badly injuring the hand of one of the workers. His blood seeped into the ground as though being frenetically sucked in. Locals decided that it was best to stay away, especially after dark. Stories like that of Abhartach were not isolated. Ireland was littered with tales of the dead coming back to eat, drink and be merry with their loved ones. Some of these stories were even told as ridiculous and highly humorous yarns, even then demonstrating the age-old patriarchal idea of the difficult mother-in-law, except in those stories she was dead and eating you out of house and home. On the other end of the country, in County Limerick, there is a story of the Black Hag of Shanagolden Abbey. During the late 16th and early 17th century, there was a woman who was described as a woman of the Fitzgeralds. This would mean that she was a woman of noble blood from the very powerful Fitzgerald clan. This woman was not just a noble woman, but also a cup tasser, a woman who was regarded as a prophetess, who would be consulted by local chieftains before battles. It was alleged that in this abbey, she drank the blood of young novices in order to maintain her youthful appearance. The abbey was eventually abandoned, but she continued to live there alone and became known as the Black Hag. There is no recorded date for her death, but local folklore claims that she was found one morning by a passer-by. He claimed that he found her sitting in a chair in the sacristy. She was dead and rigid, and frozen on her face was a look of pure terror, as though the devil himself had come to claim her soul for her dark deeds. And that is not the only story associated with this abbey. Anne Massey McElroy visited the abbey, and this is the folklore she unearthed, as written in her blog post. The Earl of Desmond, who was the House of Fitzgerald, was involved in a lengthy and often bloody feud with the Butler family, the Earldom of Ormond, during the 15th century. It was a major battle for supremacy. It was a bitter, complicated situation and sent a tidal wave of uncertainty and despair. It was so bad that in the chapel of Dublin Castle, the Earl of March, Bishop of Cloyne, recited this prayer at Mass: "Eternal God, there are two in Munster that destroy both us and our property, to wit the Earls of Ormond and Desmond, together with their bands of followers, whom in the end may the Lord destroy, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen." Now, do remember with this tale that records were notoriously badly kept, so identifying which Earl and Countess is tricky. However, under attack, the Earl Fitzgerald decided to get his wife to safety. As he was pulling her onto his steed, an arrow pierced her thigh, shattering bone and spraying blood. As he rode on into the night, the Countess took on a deathly pallor, so the Earl reined in his mount to seek sanctuary at the abbey. His wife seemed very dead indeed to the heartbroken man, so he swiftly buried her beneath the altar and continued to safety. As time passed, the order of nuns began to hear blood-curdling screams in the night. Unable to cope any longer, they decided to reinter the Countess in the hope of bringing her peace. To their horror, they discovered the corpse to have broken finger bones and nails torn out. The unfortunate woman had been buried alive. To this day, it is believed the Countess has been unable to find peace and continues to scream in anguish, waiting for her husband to save her from a fate truly worse than death. During excavations, it was determined that indeed bodies were buried within the footprint of the convent. Was one of them the reinterred Countess? It is also believed that one of the order wasn't content with servitude to God, humbleness, and helping the community. She wanted power, and that power would come at the cost of her soul. She had her own cell in which it was said she worshipped Satan and performed black magic, becoming a slave to the occult. This was the highest form of blasphemy, and the other nuns in the order fled their defiled home in fear, while the hag, as she had become, remained in her house of darkness. To complete her rituals, the black nun would go out into the local community and perform depraved sex acts and offer sacrifices, partially substantiated by the discovery of the bones of children, including a spine. Now, the name Black Hag could be as simple as the fact that with malnutrition, the lack of daylight, living conditions, and the ashes of fires, the woman would have had a gaunt, skeletal, and very much black face along with her robes. The stories of dark magic could have been used as a justification for the dissolution of the nunnery during the Reformation at the hands of Henry VIII, or at a time where witches were being hunted. The Pope was believing all the reports given to him and pointing an accusing finger, as was happening all across Europe. That was the folklore that was unearthed by Anne Massey McElroy. And according to Tony Locke in his book Irish Ghost Tales, the nuns in the abbey were found to all be practising dark and satanic rituals under the guidance of this evil abbess, and therefore the nunnery was shut down, but the evil woman remained. And interestingly, another tale of the undead returning to drain the blood of the living comes from the Dublin mountains, and also concerns somebody of the cloth, a priest, and it is retold by Tony Locke in his book Irish Ghost Tales. Once upon a time, long, long ago, there was an old widow who lived in a remote mountainous area just outside Dublin with her son. The community she lived in was scattered over a large area, and although she felt lonely at times, at least she had her young son to keep her company. As he grew up, her son spent most of his time walking the hills and valleys, either reading books given to him by some of their neighbours or just communing with nature. She noticed that as time went by, her son seemed to become more withdrawn. He spent less time at home and avoided contact with any visitors to their little cottage. The widow decided that she would speak to the priest who came to their community every Sunday to say Mass. He was from the town, and she believed that he would know what to do. After Mass on the following Sunday, she approached the priest, who listened to her and said that he would speak to her son. After speaking to her son, the priest told the woman that her son was a very intelligent young man who felt trapped living in the mountains. The priest advised her that he would make a good candidate for the priesthood and said that with her permission, he would arrange for her son to be given a place at the seminary in Maynooth. The son duly left, and never once did he write to her or come back to visit her. When he had been gone a number of years, he became sick. No one knew what was wrong with him. He developed a deathly pallor, didn't eat and slept all day, and his doctor suggested that maybe a stay in the countryside, breathing in the fresh mountain air, would help him to recover. He returned home to his mother, who by this stage was very advanced in age. He planned on staying there until he recovered. Of course, she was delighted to see him and made him very welcome. His neighbours, hearing that he had returned, called into the cottage from time to time, but he had been away for such a long time that he no longer had anything in common with them. The neighbours, who believed he was a little standoffish before he had left to become a priest, now found him to be very strange, as he didn't seem to want to talk with any of them. It was said that he no longer believed that he was a local man, was sharp with his remarks and aloof, considering himself to be better than those he had grown up with. As he was a priest, the local people would ask his advice on matters of faith, but they didn't socialise with him, and that was just the way he liked it. He began to shut himself away behind the locked door of his bedroom, covering the window to keep out the light. His mother believed that he just wanted to read his books and to be alone with his thoughts. He didn't eat or drink anything she left outside his door. At night, she would hear him going out, and in the morning he would be back in his room. She never knew where he went, and he never told her. She assumed that he had reverted to his old ways of talking to nature, and that this might be a good sign. He died suddenly just before his 50th birthday. The doctor could not determine the cause, but he said that his illness was a mystery and that at least now he was at peace. The old widow woman and a couple of her neighbours laid her son's body on the kitchen table, and everyone in the locality called to the cottage to pay their respects and to help with the funeral. He was waked the next day, and the following day his coffin was carried on a cart to the rocky graveyard a couple of miles from the cottage. All the neighbours attended the funeral. However, the old widow was devastated by the loss of her son, so it was decided that she would remain at home. As you can imagine, it took some time for the funeral procession to get to the graveyard, and the return journey was even worse. The road, if you could even call a mountain track a road, was rough and uneven, and night began to fall before the people came within sight of their homes. As mourners approached the final hill before the end of their journey, they saw a man approaching them. He seemed to be walking very quickly. All the mourners looked at each other. Every man in the community had attended the funeral, so this man's identity was a mystery. Who could that be? And why is he coming from the cottages? They asked each other. They all stopped and stood by the roadside and waited for the stranger to pass. As he came nearer, they saw his face. It was the face of the man they had just buried. He passed by on the far side of the road, walking at what was described as an almost inhuman speed. He turned his face away, but even so they were able to make out his features: pale skin, hard glittering eyes, and lips drawn across his shriveled gums as though he had died with a look of horror upon his face. He was not wearing the death shroud he had been buried in, but he had on the black frock coat he wore as a priest. He walked by them and disappeared around a bend in the road that led to the graveyard. When he had gone, the local people all made either the sign of the cross or the horned sign against the evil eye, casting fearful glances at each other. They all started talking at once, and it was decided that they should go and check on the old widow, as she was the only one left in the cottages. Eventually they arrived at the cottage and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. Climbing onto an old bucket, one of the mourners looked through the kitchen window and saw the old woman lying on the floor. Some of the bigger men opened the door and gently lifted her onto a chair. One of the women gave her a little poutine to revive her. The old widow told them what had happened. Earlier on, just as the night fell, there had been a knock on her door. She could not think who it was, as she knew that all of her neighbours were at her son's funeral, and for some reason she was afraid of answering the door. The knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. Rather than answering it, she stood on a stool and looked out the window. To her horror, she saw her dead son standing there. She saw the ghostly pallor of his skin and the terrible look of a wild animal upon his face. He was crouched down as if preparing to pounce on her when she answered the door. She said that she felt so afraid she must have fainted in fear. She felt her legs give way, and then she fell to the floor. There she remained until her neighbours arrived and picked her up. The undead priest was never seen in the neighbourhood again. but people in the remote community still pass his grave in that lonely mountain cemetery with a quick and fearful step. So just to reiterate, the information about Abhartach comes from Dr. Bob Curran. So the book Bloody Irish Celtic Vampire Legends is a book that he wrote all the way back in 2002. There's also a really great article on historyireland.com which is called Was Dracula an Irishman? The link will be in the description of this episode. The story about the priest comes from Irish Ghost Tales by Tony Locke. And then the story about the Black Hag comes from a mixture of all, but is also, the blog post comes from Dark Emerald Tales, which is by Anne Massey McElroy. And oh, do I love a good vampire story. And I do love all the old stories of Irish vampire legends. Like, I think they're really interesting because you can start to see the vampire traits creep in over time. So in the story of the priest, for example, you begin to see, you know, he only went out at night time and he covered up his windows to stop the sunlight. And then he was knocking on the door, like he wasn't able to just go in. That idea of being invited inside, like all of those are kind of later vampire tropes that we see. But these earlier vampire legends like Abhartach, they're not waiting to be invited inside. They're not, you know, these supernatural beings that kind of exist in their own entity. They were once human beings and they have the ability to come back after they are dead. And it is your responsibility as a family member to provide them with, you know, honey, whiskey, bread, whatever it is. And then if you cannot do that, they are going to be sated in one way or another, whether it's drinking the blood of your livestock or whether it is drinking the blood of family members. And as we all know, it is very likely that these stories were used to explain sudden illnesses or strange behaviour in people. I also think it was about remembering your loved ones. You know, this idea of revenants, of your loved ones coming back and eating, drinking and being merry with you. I think that's really quite a beautiful sentiment. And there's stories of loved ones literally coming back and sitting at the table with family members and eating and drinking and telling jokes and telling stories for one night. And I'm sure that people listening, oh my God, if you could have one night with the people that you've loved and lost, like imagine the joy that would bring to you to know that you could have one night with your dead loved ones. And probably, you know, this idea of our loved ones coming back was a way to create a balm, a salve to soothe people's grief when people were gone. And this beautiful idea of the women of the house sprinkling ash from the fire on the fireplace, and if it was disturbed in the morning, they would know that their loved ones had been there sitting by the fire, eating and drinking and having a chat the night before. And what I also think is really interesting about these old Irish vampire stories and ghost stories. So in the story of Abhartach, I talked about how Cahan, the chieftain, went to this man, this holy man who lived in the woods. He lived in a hermitage and he had to go and track him down, and he was able to give him the information that he needed. And actually, as time went on, that changed, and the man, the old wizard, the old druidic man that lived in the forest became a saint. And it was a saint that Cahan had tracked down, and this man was able to, you know, protect the people from these supernatural entities. And it's really interesting how over time these ideas changed to become more Christian. I also thought the different versions of the Black Hag story were really interesting. So, you know, initially she is seen as this woman of the Fitzgeralds, so a noble woman, a very powerful woman, and a woman who's a cup tasser, which is a woman who has the ability to foresee the future. So all of these chieftains are coming to her pre-battle and going, what is the outcome of this battle going to be? So she's a very powerful woman within this society. And as a Fitzgerald and a noble woman, she probably would have had land. She probably would have had people who were under her. And yet we end up with this story that she was drinking the blood of novices in this abbey in order to maintain her youthful appearance. And I can't help but think of parallels between this woman, this prophetess, and Elizabeth Bathory, who again is this noble woman, very powerful, who is believed to be torturing and drinking the blood of her servants and people around the village. And that's how she's maintaining her power and her youthful appearance. And we now know, in later years that, much of the stories about Elizabeth Bathory are completely made up, and really it was about a struggle for power and a struggle for land. And I think it's also important to remember as well that in this period of Irish history, the chieftains and the small piece of land warlords, they were hideously violent to each other. They were butchering each other left, right and centre. You just need to think about the things that happened in Leap Castle, right, where these people were just slaying each other and throwing each other in big holes and torturing each other. I mean, awful things were happening, but yet we have this story about a woman who's drinking blood and it's keeping her young. And it's really interesting because to me it feels like this sort of patriarchal takedown of a powerful woman, right? And I also think it's really interesting when we get these stories about people doing satanic rituals. These nuns were all doing black magic and, stuff from the occult and doing depraved sex acts and offering sacrifices, blah, blah, blah. And to be really frank, it's all nonsense. I don't think there was any nun in that abbey at any point that was doing depraved sex acts and offering sacrifices and doing satanic rituals. Because what does that even mean in that period of time? What do you mean by a satanic ritual? Like, you're telling me there's a whole load of nuns in rural Ireland that are practicing satanic rituals under the guidance of this evil black hag. And so therefore they were like, we've got to shut this nunnery down. And I think in this context, it is kind of important to remember that, obviously the witch trials were happening around I think it was the 16th, 17th century across Europe. However, they did not happen in Ireland in the same way. So when people in a modern context make reference to, evil old hags and dark and satanic rituals and people in the town accusing women of this, that and the other, witch trials didn't happen in Ireland in the same way. In fact, they didn't really happen in Ireland at all. And really interestingly, I went to a lecture a couple of weeks ago about the history of witchcraft with this amazing professor whose name is Diane Purkis. And I want to be her when I grow up, and she was amazing. But she did reference during the lecture, and there was loads of really enlightening stuff about witch trials and women and the history of witch trials, etc., etc. And she did highlight the fact that there weren't witch trials in Ireland, even though Ireland was a wildly patriarchal society. So I do always kind of raise my eyebrows a little bit when people, reference this time period and say, oh, these women were doing these ritualistic things and it's akin to witchcraft. Witchcraft wasn't seen the same way in Ireland. And then we also get the version of the story where this Countess Fitzgerald, this woman of noble blood, is buried alive. That she's this hapless victim of these warring tribes and she ends up being buried alive, which is a very different story again. So we sort of seem to swing between folklore where this black hag was like this really powerful woman who did evil things, and she was this hapless victim of circumstances and then was therefore buried alive, which is really interesting in terms of how we see women as a society, right? And I do think it's really interesting that last story about the Dublin Mountains centres around a priest. And for a lot of people, you might be like, okay, that doesn't seem very shocking. But priests in Ireland were revered. I mean, anything the priest said was considered gospel in every sort of possible context. And that stayed right up until the 90s, I would say, right? So priests were a very important part of society. It also meant that we ended up in a situation in Ireland where, because everything the priest said was seen as the absolute moralistic truth, then we ended up in a situation in Ireland where the Catholic Church had kind of this unbridled power over people, which is also not good, right? And there's something, I think, quite rebellious about the fact that this last story deals with a priest who becomes a vampire. And I can't decide whether it's either rebellious or whether it is a nod to, it doesn't matter who you are, these things can happen to you. But I think it's interesting that in the story, the priest is described as being like aloof and, you know, thought he was better than the locals, etc., etc. The implication being that maybe he wasn't a very nice person to people, and maybe then he was dabbling in things when he was alive that he shouldn't have been dabbling in, and ended up in this situation in death where he was coming back desperately, the implication being to drink his mother's blood. And I mean, I don't want to cast aspersions here, but somebody call Freud and tell him that Oedipus is on the loose. And my final thing that I would like to say about Celtic vampire legends is that I've seen a lot of discourse online lately about the film Sinners, which was a great film and I loved it. And the vampire antagonist in the story is an Irish vampire called Remick, right? Great character. Like, loved him as a character, thought it was a great idea. And I saw a lot of talk on TikTok in particular about how Remick is actually Abhartach. And I was like, I just don't see it. I don't see the link. I like that it has caused people to look at Celtic vampire legends and dive into the folklore around Irish vampire stories. I think that's pretty cool, right? And anything that brings Irish folklore to the forefront is always good in my book. However, do I think that Remick is actually Abhartach? No, because famously, the stone is still there. And as long as the stone is still there, Abhartach is still under the ground, thankfully. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Remember, all the links to the sources are in the description of this episode. And I would actually recommend reading all and, you know, some of those sources, maybe all of them if you can, because they are all very interesting. And if you have a story that you would like to share, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you can get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode ad free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
Hey, I'm Paige DeSorbo, and I'm always thinking about underwear.
I'm Hannah Berner, and I'm also thinking about underwear, but I prefer full coverage. I like to call them my granny panties.
Actually, I never think about underwear. That's the magic of Tommy John.
Same. They're so light and so comfy, and if it's not comfortable, I'm not wearing it.
And the bras, soft, supportive, and actually breathable.
Yes, Lord knows the girls need to breathe. Also, I need my PJs to breathe and be buttery soft and stretchy enough for my dramatic tossing and turning at night. That's why I live in my Tommy John pajamas.
Plus, they're so cute because they fit perfectly.
Put yourself on to Tommy John.
Upgrade your drawer with Tommy John. Save 25% for a limited time at TommyJohn.com/comfort. See site for details.